Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain a little bit about retrieval practice. We're going to look at some of the general science behind the idea, as well as how it's going to work in our class. Retrieval practice is worth 15% of your overall grade, and it's something we're going to be doing each week when we're not doing tests. So let's begin with a definition of what retrieval practice is. One of the ways to think about retrieval practice is another name for it, which is practice testing. And the idea behind it is that you're trying to get information out of your brain or out of your memory without the help of things like notes in front of you. So if you're rereading your notes or you're looking at stuff or you're got your textbook open in front of you, you're not doing retrieval practice. If you put this stuff aside and you try to remember, what did I learn from that information? Or you look at a question after you've read a textbook chapter or a reading and you try to answer it without the help of notes in front of you, you're doing something like retrieval practice. So it's all about testing to see if your memory and your learning is effective without the help of some kind of aid in front of you. What science has found about retrieval practice is that when we compare it to a lot of the activities that students often do to study, like reread their notes or they highlight their textbook, retrieval practice is much more effective. If you want to learn something well, and especially if you want to remember it for a long time, retrieval practice is a lot more effective than things that we typically do to learn information. Now, to explain retrieval practice and how effective it is in a little bit more detail, I want to look at a study that was done by two psychologists, Roediger and Karpicke, in 2006. This study was important because it helped to relaunch the study of retrieval practice. There's over 100 years of study that show that retrieval practice work, but Roediger and Karpicke's study helped to revive interest in it, and it helped to lead a lot of research into this topic. So what they did in their study is they recruited college students to come into their lab to do an experiment. And what the students started off by doing is they read some short passages on either the sun or sea otters. These were about 300 words each, and they had a number of ideas about their topic. So again, they were basically these short readings that they wanted to see if students would remember when they studied them and tested on them later on. The second part of their study involved randomly placing students into one of three different groups. So one group of students basically reread their passage an additional 3 times. So they were essentially doing what a lot of students do when they study for a test, which is read and reread information. Another group of students reread the passage 2 more times, but they did a practice test as well. And what the practice test was is that the students were simply given a sheet of paper and they were told, write down as much as you can remember about the passage without it in front of you. So what they were doing is essentially retrieval practice. They were trying to pull information out of their brain without the help of the article or the passage in front of them. And the researchers didn't grade this test, they didn't mark it for correctness, they simply said, try to get the information out of your brain on this piece of paper. The final group of students did practice testing multiple times. And again, they were simply given a sheet of paper, asked to write down as much as they could remember without the passage in front of them, and then they did it 2 more times. And the final thing that they did in this study is they divided each of the students randomly into one of 2 groups. Half of the students took their test just 5 minutes later, and the other half did the test 1 week later. And that final test was exactly like the practice test. What they did is they gave students a piece of paper and simply said, write down as many ideas from the original passage as you can remember. So basically they were trying to see how many of those ideas could you recall from your reading, and did practice testing essentially help you learn that information more effectively than simply rereading it multiple times. And the results of their study are shown on this graph. What this shows is basically the number of ideas that students could remember when they did their final test, based on how long they had to wait before they did their final test. So there's 2 really important findings that came out of this experiment. if you're rereading information or you're restudying information, if you're taking a test really soon, rereading can actually be more effective. So when students only had to wait 5 minutes to take their test after rereading or restudying, then they did much more effective than students who did some practice testing. So they were able to remember about 80% of all of the ideas from their passages. But when we look at the people who had to do their test a week later, they did a lot worse. So the group that did multiple rereadings or multiple studies of the passage did the worst, and they forgot over half of the information that they learned from the original article. What they also found is that if you did practice tests, and especially if you did multiple practice tests, then you did better overall a week later. So when we need to learn information for a longer period of time, then it's far better to do practice testing. And again, this group where the students studied once, tested 3 times, did better when they had to remember that information for over a week. Now think about how a lot of classes in college work. You're going to take lectures or be in a class and learn information, but your test may not happen for 4 or 5 or 6 weeks later. Or you might have a final exam that happens months later at the very end of the year. So if you're rereading information, then you're at risk of losing that information very quickly and not doing so well on a test later on. If you've ever had the experience of studying for a test, but you didn't do very well and you wondered what happened, one of the reasons might be is that you've used ineffective study methods like restudying or rereading multiple times. So if you have an opportunity, practice testing is far more effective if you want to memorize information and learn information for a longer period of time. Rereading works in the short term, but it's not very effective when it's something that we have to do to learn something for a longer period of time. So I have a couple of tips for using retrieval practice effectively in our class. This is something that we're going to be doing weekly, so you're going to get practice quizzes that are going to help you learn the information that I'm presenting in the class. The first thing that I would recommend is that before you do any of the readings is that you take a look at the retrieval practice or practice quiz that I've posted. And you don't want to actually do it before you've done the reading because you'd just be blindly guessing. But one of the things that this can do is it will sensitize you to some of the important ideas that I'm presenting in class that week. When you do a pre-test or you look at the questions in an early test that you're going to be tested on later, it helps to boost your attention and your later learning because it gives you a clue about what's important or what kind of information the professor might expect you to learn. So every week, I would suggest that you start by looking at the retrieval practice that's posted before you get into some of your other reading that you need to do. After you've done the reading, you want to do your retrieval practice. And one of the important things that you want to do when you take one of these practice tests is you want to make sure that your notes are not in front of you. So you do not want to have FOL open. You don't want to have your textbook in front of you. You want to put all of that to the side. And one of the reasons why is that there have actually been experiments done on how effective retrieval practice is with open book tests. Not surprisingly, people do well initially when they do open book tests because the answers are in front of them. But if you retest them later on and it's not an open book test again, then they tend to forget most of that information. It's a little bit like rereading. Your memory doesn't have to work so hard if you've got the stuff in front of you, so we don't hold on to it as effectively. And in our class, tests are not meant to be taken open book. So there's going to be a number of settings on the test that are going to mean that you cannot look at FOL while you're taking it, and you're not going to have enough time to look up all of the answers. So for that reason, you want to make sure that when you're doing your retrieval practice, that you do not have your book in front of you, because it's going to help you learn better, and because it's going to be more similar to how I expect you to take tests later on in the course as well. After you have done your retrieval practice, there's going to be a screen that will show you some feedback on your answers. So it will actually highlight what the correct answer was, and what you should do is review that information. Feedback, not surprisingly, has been shown to boost your learning and retention of correct answers. So if you guess something and you get it wrong, learning what the correct answer is a learning experience. And being corrected is something that tends to stick in our memory more effectively. So trying to answer and getting it wrong, but then being corrected, is actually more effective than simply rereading information. So do check on the feedback that I've given you, and also use that information to help you review what you may not have learned the first time in doing your readings or reviewing my videos and the like. So the feedback can also be a guide to tell you what you need to pay a little bit more attention to, or maybe the stuff that you need to work on. And if you're still really confused after getting the feedback, this is really a good time to reach out to me through email to ask for some guidance as well. Now, a couple of additional things about retrieval practice in our class will include the following. You're not going to be having a time limit on each of the practices, so you can take as long as you want, but they are intended to be completed in about 20 to 30 minutes. I would recommend that you try to complete the practice as quickly as possible, because later on in the class, we're not going to have unlimited amount of time to take the test. So by giving yourself a little bit of a time limit, 20 or 30 minutes, it's going to help you prepare for our later tests as well. In any case, I have designed them so that they should be able to be done in about 20 minutes if you've done your readings. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can take retrieval practice as often as you want. And in fact, this can help you study for later tests. So when we come into test weeks, one of the things that I'll recommend is that you actually redo your past retrieval practices in order to help you prepare. So this is something that you can do along with your other studying practices to help you do better on our tests in our class. The final thing that's really important is that retrieval practice in our class is not going to be graded on whether you got answers correct or not. This, again, I want to stress, is practice. This is something that you should be able to get wrong and be able to fix your mistakes for later on in the class. And because of that, I do not want to penalize you for giving incorrect answers on your retrieval practice. That is something that I'm going to save for tests instead. So you will earn the full marks for retrieval practice, 1.5%, if you attempt it and you do all of the questions. Whether or not those answers are correct or not is not going to matter. This is more about practice and participation rather than getting the answers correct. Once again, I want you to focus on studying and getting the answers right on the test when correctness will count. It's not going to count in retrieval practice. This is about learning from your mistakes. The final note that I want to give about retrieval practice is that the due date is going to be basically the next Monday after it's posted. So for the first week, this is going to be due on September 11th at midnight. So in order to earn that 1.5%, you're going to have to make your first attempt before that Monday deadline. And that Monday deadline is going to carry on for the rest of the semester, except when there's a holiday Monday, in which case the due date is going to be Tuesday instead. This is something that's also going to be posted in our calendar tool. And if you're ever unclear when it's going to be due, make sure that you check that out on our FOL page. It's going to tell you when you need to make sure that you've tried the retrieval practice at least once. So, if you have any questions about retrieval practice and how it works in our class, or anything about the research that I presented in this presentation, please reach out to contact me and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. If you've gotten interested about retrieval practice and you want to learn a little bit more, including how you might use it in your own studying in other classes, I would encourage you to check out the website retrievalpractice.org/students for some tips from the psychologists that have done the research on this topic. And they have a lot of tips that are usable for students in any class, students in college, to help them use retrieval practice for more effective studying. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I really hope that you'll find retrieval practice this semester a useful way to do some of your learning and to help you prepare for tests and maybe take away some of that test anxiety that so many of us have when we do tests. So until next time, everyone, and I'll see you then.